This was back in 2021. I had booked a small Airbnb in a town called Millhaven, a quiet place tucked somewhere between farm roads and dense woods. I was there to meet a client early the next morning. One night, that was it. In and out. At least, that was the plan. When I stepped out of the car, the neighborhood felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The houses were spaced far apart, most of them dark. Trees leaned over the road like they'd grown that way on purpose, blocking out the moonlight. No dogs barking, no traffic, just wind pushing through the leaves. Then I noticed someone walking down the road. A man, maybe 30 or 40 yards away, hoodie pulled up, hands in his pockets. He moved slowly, like he had nowhere to be. He didn't look at me, but something about him made the back of my neck tighten. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly damp, like old wood and closed windows. Nothing fancy. Small living room, narrow hallway, a bedroom in the back, exactly what the listing had shown. Still, I walked through the place twice, checked the bathroom, the kitchen cabinets, the back door. Everything looked normal. After a minute, I remembered I'd left my other bag in the car, so I stepped back outside. That's when I saw him again, the same guy. Except now he wasn't walking. He was standing in the middle of the road, and he was facing the house. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I stepped off the porch and started toward my car. As soon as I did, he turned and kept walking down the street like nothing had happened, just walked away. I watched him until he disappeared past the trees. Something about the way he stood there stuck with me, like he'd been waiting. Inside, I locked every door and window I could find. I even pulled my car into the garage and shut the door behind it. Over the next couple hours, I checked outside a few times. The road stayed empty. Eventually, exhaustion won. I set my alarm for 4 a.m. and went to bed. Sleep came in pieces. Every sound in the house seemed louder than it should have been. Pipes ticking, the fridge humming, wood creaking in the walls. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was my alarm buzzing beside the bed. 4 a.m., the room was still dark, but there was light under the door, a soft yellow strip stretching across the floor. I stared at it for a while, trying to remember if I'd left something on. I was sure I hadn't. When I stood up, the floor felt colder than it should have been. I walked to the door and reached for the handle. Then I heard something. Movement. Slow, careful movement. Somewhere down the hallway. For a moment, I thought maybe it was the house settling. Then something scraped across the floor. I opened the door. The living room light was on, and someone was inside. A man crouched near my bag, pulling things out and dropping them onto the floor. Black hoodie, ripped jeans, the same guy from the road. I must have made a noise because he stopped digging through the bag and slowly turned around. Our eyes met. What scared me most wasn't that he was there. It was the look on his face. He wasn't surprised, not even a little, like he'd known exactly which door I'd come out of. He dropped my bag and stood up. "Stay there," he said. His voice was calm, too calm. Then he started walking toward me. My body moved before my brain caught up. I spun around and ran back into the bedroom, slamming the door and locking it. A second later, he hit the other side of it. Hard. The door rattled in the frame as he kicked it again. And again. The handle started shaking. I backed away, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. Then the kicking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard the lock clicking. He was picking it. My eyes landed on the window beside the bed. I pushed it open, climbed out, and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the road. By the time police arrived 20 minutes later, the house was empty. My bags were gone. But when the officers checked the bedroom, one of them called my name from inside. The door was open. The lock had been picked clean. Whoever the guy was, he'd gotten in. I kept thinking about that for weeks afterward. If I had hidden in the bathroom, if I had stayed quiet, if I hadn't climbed out that window. But something else started bothering me later. Something small. Something I didn't notice that night. When the police asked if the man had said anything else besides, "Stay there," I told them no. I was sure of it. But a few days later, while unpacking what little stuff I had left, I kept hearing his voice in my head again. And this time, I remembered something different. Not louder, just closer. Like he had been right outside the bedroom door. And I'm almost certain he said one more thing. Not angry, not threatening, just confused. Evan? That's my name. The problem is, I never told the Airbnb host my first name. And neither did the client I was supposed to meet. I checked later. No one in Millhaven should have known I was coming. But someone was already inside that house, waiting. The address sat at the end of a quiet street in Riverton, Ohio, and something about the place didn't look right. No lights in the windows, no cars in the lot, just a narrow two-story office building sitting under a buzzing street lamp like it had been forgotten. But the order was already picked up, and it was nearly 1:10 a.m., so I parked. My name's Evan Mercer. I was doing late-night delivery shifts back in 2019, mostly to cover rent after my roommate moved out. I usually worked weekends, maybe 10 hours a week. Nothing serious. That night was supposed to be quick. 2 orders, maybe 3. This one was for a place called Harper Business Suites. The instructions in the app were weirdly specific. Enter the main hallway. Leave the order outside room 214. That meant going inside. I grabbed the bag and stepped out of the car. The air felt colder than it should have been for early fall. Not freezing, just still, heavy, like the street was holding its breath. The building looked smaller up close. Plain brick, dark windows. The only light came from a dim bulb above the front door. Through the glass, I could see a narrow hallway lined with office doors. No movement, no people. I pulled the door handle, unlocked. The moment I stepped inside, the sound of the street disappeared behind me. The hallway lights hummed overhead with that soft electric buzz old buildings have. And that was it. No voices, no typing, no phones ringing. Just that buzzing. The air smelled stale, like paper and old carpet that had soaked up too many years of coffee and dust. I walked slowly past the first few doors. 102, 104, 108, all closed, all dark. My footsteps sounded louder than they should have. Each one echoed slightly down the empty hallway. Halfway down, I saw a door propped open with a rubber wedge. A stairwell. The lights inside were off. I stepped closer and looked up. The stairs vanished into darkness after the first turn. Not even a glow from the second floor. Just thick black space above me. Something about that bothered me more than it should have. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening. That's when I noticed how quiet the building really was. Not normal late-night quiet. Not office after-hours quiet. Dead quiet. Then a door opened behind me. I turned so fast, I nearly dropped the food. A man stepped into the hallway from one of the offices I'd just passed. The room behind him was completely dark. He looked wrong for the place. Jeans, worn hoodie, baseball cap pulled low. His eyes stayed fixed on me, like he'd been watching for a while. Neither of us spoke at first. Then he slowly raised his arm and pointed past me. 214's upstairs, he said. His voice was calm, too calm. I nodded, but my feet didn't move. He kept staring. There was something strange about the way he held himself. His shoulders were stiff, like he was waiting for something, or someone. After a few seconds, he took a small step forward, not aggressive, just closer. "You going up?" he asked. My hands started shaking a little. I don't know why. Nothing had actually happened. Still, something in my head kept repeating the same thought. Don't go up there. So I crouched down, set the bag on the carpet, and slid it against the wall. "Orders here?" I said. Then I turned and walked toward the exit. Not running, not yet, just walking. The man didn't follow me. But behind me, I heard him step into the stairwell. His footsteps climbed slowly upward. One step, another, then silence again. I didn't stop walking until I was outside. The night air felt warmer than the building somehow. I got into my car and sat there for a minute, staring at the entrance. Nothing moved inside. Eventually, I drove away. I didn't report anything. Honestly, I felt stupid even thinking about it afterward. Maybe the guy worked there. Maybe cleaning crews came late. Maybe I just freaked myself out. The next afternoon, a police officer called me. They'd pulled my license plate from security footage. The building had been broken into sometime after midnight. The officer asked if I'd seen anyone inside. I told him about the man in the hallway. There was a pause on the phone. Then he asked something that made my stomach turn. "Did you go upstairs?" I told him no. Another pause. "Good," he said quietly. Later that day, they showed me still images from the security cameras. One picture showed me walking down the hallway with the delivery bag. Another showed the man stepping out of the office. But the third image is the one I still think about. It was taken from the camera at the top of the stairwell. Two men were standing there in the dark, waiting, watching the stairs. The officer said they'd been there for several minutes before I arrived. Apparently, 3 separate delivery orders had been placed to that building that night. Mine was the only driver who went inside. I asked if they'd caught the guys. The officer said they were still looking. But before I left, he asked me one more thing. Something I still don't know how to answer. He pointed to the photo of the hallway. "You're sure you didn't go upstairs?" I told him I hadn't. He nodded slowly. Then he turned the photo toward me again. And for the first time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The delivery bag wasn't sitting where I remembered leaving it. It was halfway up the stairs.
It was October of 2019 when I visited my cousin Daniel in a place called Ridgewood Hollow, a small logging town tucked deep into northern Pennsylvania. I hadn't seen him in years. He moved out there after getting a job with the Forestry Service. The town had 1 grocery store, 2 bars, and more trees than people. On my last night there, we were sitting on his back porch finishing a couple beers when he brought it up. "There's something out in the woods," he said casually. "Not on any map." I laughed, thinking he meant a campsite or some old cabin, but he shook his head. "Half-built neighborhood, houses just left there. Nobody ever talks about it." He'd found it months earlier while hiking, but never went inside. Said the place gave him a weird feeling. That was enough for me. We grabbed flashlights and headed out before either of us could talk ourselves out of it. The trail started normally enough. Gravel road, then a dirt path cutting through tall pines. The sun was sinking behind the trees, turning everything gray and cold. After about 20 minutes, the trail disappeared, replaced by a faint path through thick brush. Daniel walked ahead like he'd been there before. I followed, listening to the crunch of leaves under our boots. After nearly an hour, the trees opened up, and there they were. 5 houses, maybe 6, spread across a clearing like someone had started building a neighborhood and suddenly walked away from it. The houses didn't look old. That was the strange part. Vinyl siding, asphalt shingles. One still had plastic wrap clinging to a window frame, but everything else looked wrong. Windows smashed, doors hanging open, tall weeds growing through unfinished driveways. It felt like someone had paused construction in the middle of the day and never came back. Daniel whistled quietly. "Told you. Someone had been there before us." Spray paint covered the walls. Crude drawings, names, symbols I didn't recognize. We walked to the nearest house. The front door was already open. Inside, the air smelled damp and stale, like wet wood and old insulation. My flashlight beam slid across bare walls and warped floorboards. Grass was pushing up through cracks in the foundation. Looks like they barely finished the frame, I said. Daniel didn't answer. He was staring at the staircase. We went upstairs. The second floor felt colder, not freezing, just enough that I noticed it on my skin. The hallway had 2 doors and an attic hatch in the ceiling. I opened the first door. Empty room. No drywall, just wooden studs and the distant sound of wind outside. Then something moved downstairs. Not loud, just a slow shuffle through the grass outside the house. Daniel's hand grabbed my arm. Someone's here. The footsteps reached the porch, then the doorway. A man's voice drifted up from the first floor. Hello? The word stretched strangely, like he wasn't used to speaking. Neither of us answered. I saw your lights, the voice said. Just want to talk. There was something off about his speech. Soft, slurred, like his mouth didn't quite form the words right. Daniel leaned close to my ear. Stay quiet. We listened. Floorboards creaked once below us, then nothing. A full minute passed. 2. No footsteps leaving. No voice. No movement. Finally Daniel whispered, I'm checking. He stepped carefully down the stairs while I waited at the top. My light fixed on the dark hallway. A few seconds later, he looked back up at me. His face had gone completely pale. There's no one here. I came down fast. The doorway stood open to the clearing. Cold night air drifting in. No one outside. No one inside. We stepped onto the porch and aimed our lights toward the grass. Footprints. A clear line of them leading from the direction of the other houses, right to our door. But none leading away. Daniel stared at them. They stop here. My stomach dropped. The footprints didn't turn. They didn't circle the house. They simply ended at the doorway. Daniel whispered, we should go. We started backing away when something creaked upstairs. Slow, deliberate, like someone shifting their weight on old floorboards. Both of us froze. The attic hatch above the hallway had moved. Just slightly, not open. Just enough to show a thin strip of darkness above it. Neither of us had touched it. Daniel's breathing got fast. Did you open that earlier? No, for a second. I thought I saw something behind the crack. Movement? Like someone leaning closer to listen. Then the man's voice came again. But this time, it wasn't downstairs. It was directly above us. Soft. Patient. I thought you left. Daniel didn't wait to hear anything else. We ran. Branches whipped at our arms as we tore through the woods. Neither of us spoke until we reached the main trail nearly 40 minutes later. Even then we just kept walking. When we finally stopped, Daniel said something that still bothers me. He asked, did you hear the second voice? I asked what he meant. He looked confused. When the guy spoke from the attic, Daniel said slowly, there were 2 people talking up there. I told him he was wrong. There was only one voice. But the longer I think about that night, the less sure I am, because when we first walked into that house, I could have sworn the attic hatch was already slightly open.
Last November, my apartment in Harrow Creek had its wiring burn out after a storm. No power, no heat. The landlord said repairs would take a week. I work remotely, so that wasn't an option. The only place I could find on short notice was a cheap rental cabin outside town, 40 minutes away, deep in a place locals called Black Ridge Valley. Not dangerous exactly, just the kind of area people avoided after dark. The host's name was Marling. I never met her. She texted me a door code and told me to make myself comfortable. The cabin looked older than the photos. The porch light buzzed weakly, flickering like it was struggling to stay on. The air smelled damp, like wet wood and something metallic underneath. I dropped my bag, checked the locks, and went straight to bed. I barely slept the past few days. The next morning I woke up early and set up my laptop at a small desk facing the hallway. I had meetings stacked all day and barely looked away from the screen. Around 9, there was a knock at the door. Just one. not loud, not urgent. I froze for a second. When I opened the curtain beside the door, a man was standing on the porch. Early 30s maybe, thin, covered in faded tattoos that crawled up his neck and disappeared under his jaw. He didn't knock again. He just stood there, staring at the door like he knew someone was inside. I stayed quiet. After about 30 seconds, he stepped off the porch and walked away. I figured he had the wrong place. Work swallowed the rest of the day. Calls, emails, spreadsheets. I didn't move from that chair until evening. Around 8, I grabbed takeout from a diner down the road. When I came back and sat down to eat, the knock happened again. 3 slow taps. I already knew who it was before I checked. The same man stood on the porch. This time he looked irritated, like I'd kept him waiting. I didn't open the door, just closed the curtain and went back to my food. Eventually, the silence outside came back. Around midnight, I decided to finish one last task before bed. I put on headphones and worked for another hour. When I finally shut my laptop, the room went dark, except for the faint porch light leaking through the curtains. That's when I noticed something on the floor. At first, I thought it was dirt, but when I leaned closer, my stomach dropped. Footprints. Dark, damp prints across the wood floor. They started near the back door and led down the hallway, right behind my chair. My throat tightened. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself they were mine. But they weren't. They were bigger, and they were barefoot. I followed them slowly toward the kitchen. The back door was cracked open. Cold air slipped inside, carrying a damp, rotten smell from outside. For a moment, I just stood there, listening. The house was silent. Then I heard it. A soft step upstairs. Another. Slow. Careful. Someone was moving around above me. My chest felt like it was collapsing inward. I backed toward the door, not taking my eyes off the staircase. Then a figure leaned into view at the top step. The tattooed man. He stared at me like he was confused, like I wasn't supposed to be there. For a second, neither of us moved. Then his expression changed. Not angry exactly, more like disappointment. I didn't wait to see what came next. I ran, straight through the back door and into the trees behind the cabin. Branches scraped my arms as I pushed deeper into the woods. My lungs burned. I ducked behind a thick pine and pulled out my phone. I started dialing 911. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Fast, closer than I expected. I killed the screen and held my breath. The footsteps rushed past my tree and kept going into the dark. I waited a long time before moving. When the police arrived, they searched the cabin. They didn't find anyone, but they did find something else. The officer walked me back inside and pointed at the floor. The footprints were still there, barefoot, wet, except now there were 2 sets. One set leading from the back door upstairs, and another coming from the hallway, stopping directly behind the chair where I'd been sitting all day. The officer asked me something I still don't know how to answer. He asked if I'd been sleepwalking, because the second set of footprints matched my size exactly. I told them that couldn't be possible, but sometimes I wake up at night and remember something strange. The feeling of cold wood under my feet, walking through the hallway, opening the back door, and standing there in the dark, waiting for someone to come inside. Back in 2019, my sister Lena and I rented a cabin outside a tiny town called Ridge Hollow, Oregon. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway. Lena had just gone through a messy divorce, and I'd been working too much. 3 days in the woods sounded perfect. The listing described the place as peaceful, secluded, surrounded by forest. That part was accurate. The taxi dropped us off just before sunset. The driver didn't even turn off his engine while we unloaded our bags. When Lena joked that he must really hate the woods, he just shrugged and said, "Signal dies out here. If you need a ride back, order it early." Then he drove off. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the forest had been holding its breath. The cabin sat alone in a clearing. No neighboring houses. No road noise. Just tall pines packed tightly together, their branches blocking most of the sky. Inside, the place was tiny but cozy. A small kitchen, a couch by a stone fireplace, and a wooden ladder leading to a low loft with a mattress. You had to crawl to get into the bed. Lena laughed when she saw it. "Feels like a treehouse," she said. We unpacked groceries, made some pasta, and opened a cheap bottle of wine. By the time the fire was going and the cabin warmed up, the outside world had turned completely black. Not dark like a city night. Black like the woods had erased everything past the windows. Around 11 p.m., Lena was halfway through telling a story about her ex when she suddenly stopped talking. "You hear that?" At first, I didn't. Then I did. Footsteps, slow ones. Grass crunching just outside the cabin. Not far away, either. Close enough that you could almost picture someone pacing around the walls. Lena sat up straight on the couch. Her fingers tightened around the wine glass. "Maybe it's a deer," I said. But even while I said it, the steps sounded wrong. Too steady, too heavy. I went to the window and looked outside. The porch light hadn't been turned on yet. All I could see was the reflection of the cabin behind me and the vague outlines of trees swaying slightly in the wind. Nothing moved. I stepped outside and flipped the switch for the porch light. The clearing lit up just enough to show the dirt driveway and a patch of grass. No person, no animal, just the forest staring back. When I went back inside, Lena was still listening. "It didn't walk away," she whispered. "What do you mean?" "It just stopped." She pointed toward the back of the cabin. The room felt colder suddenly. I checked the windows one by one. Nothing outside. No shapes moving between the trees. Then I heard it. A dull thump above us. Lena looked up slowly. Another thump. The ceiling creaked. Something was walking on the roof. Not running. Not stumbling. Walking. Each step made the wooden beams groan slightly. We didn't say anything for a moment. Even breathing felt loud. "Call someone," Lena said quietly. I grabbed my phone and dialed the sheriff's office. Explaining where we were took forever. The signal kept cutting out. While we waited, the footsteps kept moving across the roof. Back and forth. Slow, deliberate. Like whoever it was had nowhere else to be. At one point, it stopped directly above the loft. We both stared up at the ceiling. A faint scraping sound followed, like someone dragging their hand across the wood. Lena whispered, "Why would someone climb up there?" I didn't answer. About 40 minutes later, the footsteps moved again. We heard boots slide down the slanted roof, and a soft thud outside. I rushed to the window. For a moment, I saw them. A tall shape standing at the edge of the clearing, completely still. Then it turned and walked into the trees. By the time the sheriff arrived, the forest looked empty again. He searched around with a flashlight, but didn't find much. Just some faint marks in the dirt near the cabin. Before he left, he glanced up at the roof. "You folks say someone was up there for nearly an hour?" "Yeah," I said. He nodded slowly, like he was doing math in his head. Then he said something strange. "There's no ladder." I frowned. "What?" He pointed at the cabin walls. They'd have needed something to get up there. We spent the rest of the night in a motel back in Ridge Hollow. The next morning, Lena wanted to forget about the whole thing. Said it was probably just some local messing with tourists. But something kept bothering me. Later that afternoon, I called the cabin owner, just to ask if anyone lived nearby. There was a long pause on the phone. Then he said, carefully, "You did stay in the new cabin, right?" "New cabin?" The old one burned down in 2006, he said. Strangest thing. Fire investigators said someone had been living on the roof. I felt my stomach tighten. Living? Yeah. They never found out how he kept getting up there. Another pause. Then he added quietly, or how long he'd been watching the people inside. Back in 2011, I was driving north through western Pennsylvania, cutting across a long stretch of highway between small towns most people have never heard of. I had just left a job site in Ohio and was heading toward Bangor, Maine for another contract. The trip was supposed to be routine. 3 days of driving, maybe 4 if I stopped to see my older sister in Connecticut. By the 4th night, I was exhausted. The GPS had pushed me onto smaller and smaller roads, the kind that disappear into trees and farmland. No traffic, no houses. Just long strips of wet asphalt cutting through forest. My name's Evan Carter, and I'm not the type who scares easily. I've worked construction sites at night, abandoned buildings, places that groan and settle in the dark. But something about that road felt wrong. It was too quiet. Even with the rain? The fuel light came on around 9:30 p.m. I wasn't worried at first. Towns had been scattered along the route all day. Gas stations every 20 or 30 miles. Except suddenly, there were none. Just trees. The road twisted deeper into the hills, and the rain thickened into a steady sheet that the wipers could barely keep up with. My phone signal dropped to 1 bar. Then none. 30 minutes passed. The needle fell below empty. That's when I saw the sign. It wasn't lit, just a metal board leaning slightly to one side. GAS 1 mile. I almost missed the turn. The station sat back from the road, half hidden by tall pines. My headlights found 2 pumps under a sagging metal canopy and a small convenience store behind them. The place looked tired, not abandoned exactly, just old. The kind of place you imagine old truckers stopping at 30 years ago. I pulled in. The rain hammered against the roof of the car as I stepped out. Cold water soaked through my jacket instantly. The pump felt rough and sticky when I picked it up. I slid my card in. Nothing. No screen. No beep. No lights. Just dead plastic. I tried the second pump. Same thing. For a moment, I stood there listening to the rain bouncing off the metal roof above me. No humming machines. No buzzing lights. Nothing. Then I noticed the glow. Inside the store. A dim yellow light flickering somewhere toward the back. The glass door was fogged over with condensation. I wiped a circle with my sleeve, but still couldn't see much inside. Just shapes. Shelves, maybe. I pulled the handle. The hinges screamed. The smell hit me first. Stale air, damp cardboard. Something metallic underneath it. The shelves inside were mostly empty. A few had collapsed. Candy racks twisted sideways. Dust thick enough that my footprints showed with every step. This wasn't an old store. This place had been dead for years. The only light came from a small desk lamp sitting on the floor near the back hallway. And that's when I heard something move. A faint scrape, like a shoe dragging across tile. I froze. Hello? I called out. My voice sounded wrong in that room. Too loud. No answer. But I had the sudden feeling someone was standing just beyond the edge of the light, watching. That was enough for me. I turned and walked back outside. The rain felt colder now. I stepped off the porch and looked toward my car. Someone was standing beside it. A man. He was soaked through, hair plastered across his face. He had both hands against the window, peering inside like he was searching for something. "Hey!" I shouted. My voice cracked a little. The man slowly turned his head toward me. His eyes looked strange, not angry, just tired. Before he could say anything, he glanced over my shoulder and stepped back. The store door creaked open behind me. I didn't hear footsteps, but I felt someone there. When I turned, another man stood in the doorway, tall, thin, long dark hair hanging in wet strands across his face. His skin looked pale under the dim yellow light. For a moment, none of us moved. Then he started running, straight at me, not yelling, not speaking, just running. The soaked man beside my car backed away into the darkness, like he wanted nothing to do with it. My hands were shaking as I yanked the car door open and threw myself inside. The lock slammed down just as the man reached the handle. He pulled hard. The car jerked forward as I hit the gas. For a split second, his face was right beside the window. And I swear, he was smiling. Then something scraped violently across the side of the car. Metal grinding against metal. I didn't stop driving. 30 minutes later, the engine died, completely empty. The road was still dark, but at least my phone had signal again. While I waited for roadside assistance, I stepped out with a flashlight. The scratch along the driver's door ran almost the entire length of the car, deep, like someone had dragged a knife across it while I pulled away. The tow truck driver arrived around midnight. I told him about the station. He stared at me for a long time before speaking. There hasn't been a gas station on that road since the late 90s. I thought he was joking. But later that night, a state trooper confirmed it. The building burned down in 1998 after 2 men disappeared there during a robbery. The property had been abandoned ever since. No electricity, no pumps, no roof left standing. Sometimes I still wonder about one detail. When I got back on the highway and checked the side mirror, I could have sworn I saw headlights far behind me on that empty road, slowly following. And every time I try to remember the soaked man standing by my car, I realize something that doesn't make sense. He never looked scared. He looked like someone who had already tried to leave and failed. In the winter of 2018, I was driving across the country from Seattle to Milwaukee. 3 days on the road alone. Too many hours staring at the same strip of highway. To break it up, I booked cheap Airbnbs along the route. My first stop was a place outside a tiny Wyoming town called Ridgway. If you blinked while driving through it, you'd miss the whole town. Snow started falling as soon as I crossed the state line. Not light snow either. Thick, heavy flakes that turned the road white in less than an hour. By the time I reached Ridgway, it was already dark. The kind of dark you only get in the middle of nowhere. No street noise. No cars. No people. I drove slowly down the main road, hoping to find a gas station or somewhere to grab food. There was nothing open. Just a bar with a flickering neon sign and a hardware store already closed for the night. My Airbnb sat about half a mile outside town. A narrow driveway cut through a field of untouched snow. Tall pine trees stood in a row near the house, their branches heavy and sagging. The place itself was small, maybe 500 square feet. 1 living room, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom. That was it. I punched in the door code, stepped inside, and flipped on the lights. The air smelled stale. Not rotten exactly. Just used, like the house had been closed up too long. I dropped my bag beside the bed and walked back to the living room couch. The second I sat down, thump, a heavy sound came from the bedroom. Not loud enough to be something falling, but solid, like weight shifting on wood. I froze. For a moment I just listened. The house had that deep, quiet stillness you get during a snowstorm. The kind where even your breathing sounds too loud. I stood up and walked back to the bedroom. Everything looked normal. Bed neatly made, neatstand, lamp. There was a small bathroom connected to the room. I checked inside. Empty. The only other door in the house was the closet. I grabbed the handle and pulled. It wouldn't open. It felt like someone was holding it from the other side. I stood there for a second, staring at the door. Then I laughed quietly to myself. "Relax, man," I muttered. Probably a storage closet. Owners keep their stuff locked up all the time. That explanation sat well enough in my head. I went back to the living room and stretched out on the couch. After about 15 minutes, I got up and checked the window. Snow was still falling hard. The trees outside were just dark shapes swaying slightly in the wind. No lights from town. No passing cars. Just white snow and black trees. I closed the blinds. And that's when I saw it. A shadow moved inside the bedroom. Not fast, slow, smooth, like a door quietly opening. My chest tightened. I walked back down the hallway, each step feeling louder than it should have. The bedroom light was still on. Nothing had moved, except the closet. I could feel it before I even looked. Something about that door had changed. I grabbed the handle again. This time it turned easily. The door creaked open. Inside was a small walk-in closet, completely empty. No boxes, no shelves, nothing. I stood there confused, trying to figure out how the door could have been locked before. Then I heard breathing behind me, slow, heavy. I turned around. A man was standing in the bathroom doorway. I hadn't heard the door open. He was big, taller than me. His clothes were filthy, damp with melted snow. His face looked like he'd been through a fight, cuts across his cheek, dried blood around his nose. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I remember noticing his eyes. Not angry, not surprised, just tired, like he'd been awake for days. He stepped into the room slowly. I didn't move. He crouched beside the bed and reached underneath it, pulling out a dirty duffel bag. The zipper rattled softly as he lifted it. When he stood up, we were only a few feet apart. I expected him to say something, ask who I was, tell me to leave. But he didn't even look at me. He walked past me, through the living room, and opened the front door. Cold air rushed in. By the time I reached the window, he was already halfway across the field, leaving a dark trail of footprints in the snow. Then he disappeared into the trees. I called the police later. They said they'd contact the host. That was the last I heard about it. But there's something that still bothers me. A small detail I didn't think about until the next morning. When I woke up, my bag was still beside the bed exactly where I dropped it. Except the zipper was open. And inside, my clothes had been moved, not stolen, just shifted around, like someone had been quietly searching through them while I slept. I keep trying to remember something small. When I first arrived at the house, was the bathroom door open? Or was it already closed? Because if it was closed, then the man in the doorway couldn't have come from the closet. And that would mean he had been somewhere else in that house the entire time, waiting. This happened in 2017 when I was hiking alone through the Ironwood Range in northern Washington. It's a long, quiet stretch of backcountry that hardly anyone talks about. 6 days out and back if you take your time. My name's Caleb. I'd done a lot of solo trips before, so the silence didn't usually bother me. But this one did. On my third day out, I ran into the only other person I'd seen on the entire trail. His name was Owen, late 30s maybe, quiet guy. He was sitting beside a small tent at a campsite near the river bend. We talked for maybe 10 minutes while I filtered water. Heading to Raven Ridge? He asked. Yeah, I said. Planning to stay there a couple nights. He nodded slowly. I'll probably reach it tomorrow. Something about him felt distracted, like he kept listening for something deeper in the trees. I remember asking if he was all right. He just shrugged. Just didn't sleep much. Then he smiled, but it looked forced. We said goodbye, and I continued up the trail. Raven Ridge was incredible. Open cliffs, miles of forest below. I stayed 2 nights just watching clouds roll through the valleys, but Owen never showed up. At first, I figured he turned around. Happens all the time. On the morning of day 5, I packed up and started the hike back down. My legs were sore in a way that didn't make sense, like I'd pushed harder than I remembered. I kept trying to think back over the last few days, but parts of it felt blurry. By the time I reached the lower forest, the sun was already dropping. That's when I realized I might make it back to Owen's campsite before dark. The thought actually made me feel better. Another person out there meant company, maybe a shared fire. But when I reached the clearing, the tent was still there, exactly where it had been. No fire pit, no gear outside, no movement. Just the tent. The air smelled damp and metallic, like wet stone. "Owen?" I called out. Nothing. I stepped closer. The zipper on the tent was halfway open. Inside was an empty sleeping bag and a pack leaning against the side wall. He hadn't packed. My stomach tightened. "Owen?" I called again, louder. The forest didn't answer. I stood there listening, heart thumping harder with every second. Then I saw the light. A weak glow through the trees, maybe 40 yards away. It wasn't moving, just sitting there between the trunks. I grabbed my headlamp and walked toward it, every step crunching loudly in the quiet. The beam led me to a headlamp lying in the dirt, still on. The batteries were dying, the light barely hanging on. I bent down to pick it up. That's when I felt it. Someone standing behind me. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head. There was a man between the trees, maybe 10 yards away. He was just standing there, watching. It wasn't Owen. This guy was taller, thin. His face was mostly hidden in shadow, but I could see his shoulders rise and fall with slow breaths. "Hey," I said carefully. You know the guy staying here?" He didn't answer, didn't move, just kept watching. Something cold slid down my spine. "I'm just passing through," I said. Didn't mean to bother anyone. Still nothing. The silence between us stretched until my hands started shaking. "All right," I said quietly. "I'm leaving." I backed away toward the campsite, never taking my eyes off him. He didn't follow, didn't speak. He just watched. When I reached the clearing again, I grabbed my pack and started down the trail as fast as I could walk. About 20 seconds later, the light behind me clicked off. The darkness that followed felt heavier than normal night, like the forest had just closed its eyes. I hiked another 3 miles before I stopped. The next day, I reported everything to the ranger station in the town of Pine Hollow. 2 weeks later, they called me. Owen had been reported missing by his sister. Search teams went out. They found his tent, his gear, the headlamp, but they didn't find Owen, and they didn't find anyone else either. There's one thing that still bothers me, though, something I didn't mention to the rangers. That night, after I finally reached the next campsite, I emptied my pack to grab my stove. And sitting in the bottom pocket was Owen's missing headlamp, the same one I'd picked up in the woods. I remember holding it under my lantern light for a long time, trying to understand how it got there, because I swear, I dropped it when I saw the man watching me. And sometimes when I think about that night, I start wondering about something else. When I try to remember Owen's campsite, I can clearly picture the tent, the river, the clearing, but no matter how hard I try, I can't remember what Owen's face looked like. Not even a little. This happened in the fall of 2019, near a small place called Briar Ridge, about 5 hours north of where I live. There's a lake hidden deep in those woods. No signs, no real trail, just something locals occasionally mention if you press them long enough. I'd been there once before, years earlier. It was quiet, empty, the kind of place where even the wind sounds careful. That's exactly why I went back. The first afternoon was normal enough. I set up my tent near the grassy edge of the lake, cooked some instant noodles, and watched the sun drop behind the trees. The water barely moved. No boats, no birds, just long stretches of silence broken by the creaking of branches. For hours, I thought I had the whole place to myself. Then around sunset, I saw smoke rising from the opposite side of the lake. At first, I figured it was someone passing through, maybe another camper who knew about the spot. Through the trees, I spotted him moving around a small fire. A tall guy, thin, dark jacket. I couldn't see his face from that distance. Later that evening, he walked the long way around the lake toward me. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," he said when he got close. His name was Owen. He said he'd driven up from a town called Millbrook and had been hiking for most of the day before finding the lake. His voice was calm, easy to talk to. Mid-20s, maybe? Around my age. We stood by the fire for a while, talking about normal things. Work, the long drive. How strange it felt to find a place this quiet. The whole time, though, something about him felt slightly off, not threatening, just distracted, like he kept forgetting where he was. At one point, he asked how long I'd been camping there. I told him since that afternoon. He nodded slowly. "That's weird," he said. "Why?" "I thought I saw your fire last night." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. But he quickly shrugged it off. Must have been someone else. Before long, he headed back to his side of the lake. Night settled in thick and cold. The woods got quiet in a way that almost felt heavy, like the trees were pressing closer together. I stayed up by the fire longer than I meant to, listening to the lake water lap softly against the shore. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps, slow ones, moving through the leaves. I assumed it was Owen again, but when I looked up, I didn't see anyone. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just an animal. Eventually, I crawled into my tent. Sleep came in patches. Every little noise seemed louder than it should have been. Branches snapping, something brushing against the fabric of the tent. Once, I swear, I heard whispering somewhere across the water. By morning, the lake looked completely normal again, but something had changed. Owen's campsite was gone. No tent, no fire pit, no footprints. Just an empty patch of grass. At first, I thought he'd packed up early and left. But while I was making coffee, I noticed something on the ground near my tent. Boot prints, a lot of them, circling my campsite. Not one set, several. They stopped a few feet from my tent entrance, like someone had been standing there, watching. That's when I heard Owen's voice behind me. "Morning." I turned so fast I spilled half the coffee. He was standing at the edge of the trees. Same jacket, same calm expression. But now there were dark smudges under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. "You moved your camp?" I asked. He tilted his head. "My camp?" "Yeah." "Across the lake." He stared at me for a few seconds, then slowly shook his head. "I just got here this morning." The air felt colder all of a sudden. I pointed toward the ground. "Those footprints around my tent, were those yours?" Owen looked down. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he spoke quietly. "I thought those were yours." Neither of us laughed. The woods behind him were completely still. Then, somewhere deep in the trees, we heard something move. Not footsteps, more like something heavy dragging through leaves. Owen turned toward the sound. His face had gone pale. "That's the direction I came from," he said. I opened my mouth to ask something, but he suddenly grabbed my arm. "Did you bring anyone with you?" "No." "Are you sure?" Before I could answer, we both noticed something on the surface of the lake. Ripples, slow ones, moving toward the shore, like something underneath was rising. The water bulged slightly, then went still again. Neither of us spoke. We just stood there listening to the forest. After a while, Owen said he was going to pack up and leave. I agreed. But when I turned to grab my bag, I noticed something that made my hand start shaking. More footprints. Fresh ones, leading from the woods, straight to the lake, and stopping at the water's edge, like someone had walked into the lake during the night, or come out of it. I looked up to tell Owen, but he wasn't there anymore. His voice called from somewhere across the lake, the exact same words he'd said the night before. Didn't expect to see anyone out here. I never saw where he was standing, and when I finally got to my car and checked the map later, I realized something that still doesn't make sense. There isn't supposed to be a lake anywhere near Briar Ridge, at least, not anymore. In 2017, I bought a 2-story house on the edge of Maple Ridge, a quiet town about an hour outside Spokane. The place wasn't huge, but it was bigger than anything a single guy really needed. 4 bedrooms, narrow hallway upstairs, creaky wooden stairs that always sounded louder at night. Back when my cousin Dylan and a friend from work lived with me, the space made sense. But eventually they moved out. After that, it was just me. I used 2 rooms, my bedroom and the one across the hall where I kept my gaming setup. The other 2 bedrooms sat at the far end of the hallway. One had old storage boxes stacked along the wall. The last room was empty. I hadn't stepped inside it in months. There was never any reason to. One night in late October, I got home around 9. I'd grabbed takeout on the way back and planned to stay up all night gaming since I didn't have work the next morning. The house was quiet the way it always was. That deep, padded silence you only get when no one else is around. I went upstairs, dropped into my chair, put my headset on, and started loading into a match. That's when I heard it. A knock, not loud, just a dull thud. I pulled the headset off and waited. Nothing. I checked the clock on my monitor. 9:17 p.m. If someone had actually knocked, they would have done it again. So I shrugged it off, put my headset back on, and kept playing. About 2 hours passed. Then it happened again. Another sound. Not exactly a knock this time. More like wood hitting wood. A dull bump somewhere in the house. With my headset on, it was hard to place. I paused the game and listened. Silence. The kind where you start noticing things you normally don't. The faint buzz of the fridge downstairs. Wind against the siding. My own breathing inside the headset. I stood up and opened my bedroom door. The hallway was dark, except for the small nightlight near the stairs. Nothing moved. Hello? I called out, half joking. No answer. I walked downstairs and checked the front door. Still locked. Deadbolt in place. For a second, I just stood there, hand on the knob, listening. The house smelled faintly stale, like old carpet and dust. Something else, too. Something damp I couldn't place. Probably the basement, I figured. I locked the door again anyway. When I went back upstairs, I left my gaming room door open. If there was a sound again, I wanted to hear it clearly. I put my headset back on, played another round. 20 minutes later, the match ended. I leaned back in my chair, stretching my neck. That's when something moved in the hallway. Not a shadow. A person. A shape rushed past my doorway, so fast I only caught the edge of it. Pale. Thin. Too close to the wall. My chair slammed back as I stood up. The headset hit the floor. For a moment I couldn't move. My eyes stayed locked on the hallway. Nothing. Just that dim yellow light near the stairs. My hands started shaking. Hello? I said again, but my voice came out wrong. Too quiet. No answer. I stepped into the hallway. Each floorboard creaked louder than it ever had before. I checked the bathroom. Empty. My bedroom. Empty. The storage room. Boxes untouched. Only one door left, the empty bedroom at the end of the hall. I hadn't opened that door in weeks, maybe longer. I stood there staring at it. The air felt colder down that end of the hallway. And there was a smell. Not strong. Just stale, like breath trapped in a closed space. My fingers hesitated on the doorknob. Then I pushed the door open. The room was dark, but the moonlight through the window showed enough. The mattress from the old bed frame was on the floor. Blankets, water bottles, food wrappers. Someone had been living in there. For a second, my brain couldn't process it. Then I heard something downstairs. A floorboard. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to make noise. My stomach dropped. I walked to the top of the stairs and looked down. The front door was open, just slightly, moving with the wind. The police came about 20 minutes later. They searched the whole house. One officer said whoever it was had probably been staying in that empty room for a while, maybe slipping in and out while I was at work. They asked if I'd noticed anything missing. I said no, but that wasn't entirely true, because while they were still searching the house, one of the officers called me over. He was standing in my gaming room, pointing at the inside wall, right behind my desk. There were small scratches in the paint, thin lines, dozens of them, like someone had been dragging something sharp against the wall, over and over. The officer asked if I knew what they were. I told him no. But later that night, after everyone left, I sat in my chair and stared at them for a long time. Because the scratches weren't random. They formed rows. Tally marks. Hundreds of them. And the newest ones looked fresh. So fresh, the paint dust was still on the floor. Which means someone had been in that room recently. Very recently. What I still can't figure out is why the last tally mark was carved on my side of the wall.